good afternoon, everybody. For me, it's actually good morning because I'm sitting here in London, and but you are sitting probably, I assume, in Poland. So that's why we're going to say good afternoon. And thanks for joining this short webinar, which is about uncertainty, probably the topic of the moment. Actually, a topic that is always relevant for executives, but perhaps never more so than right now. I saw many familiar names among the participants, so I'm quite confident many of you do already know me. If you don't know me, just in a nutshell, I had the pleasure of working with GFKM on the MBA program for over, I think, 15 years now, so quite a long time. And I'm full-time employed at Ashridge in the UK. But I'm also adjunct faculty, not only at GFKM, but also at INSEAD and at DTU in Copenhagen. Now we have about a little less than 1 hour together, which probably will be something like 45 minutes input from my side, and then an opportunity for you to ask questions. So this webinar is being recorded, and you will also be able to receive the slides that we are showing whilst we go through. So they're going to be available just after the session. So what's the plan? What's the agenda? How uncertain is our world really? What is this measure of uncertainty? That will be a quick opener. And then a first observation, which is a quite personal observation. You probably have made a similar observation recently. Expertise is not always the answer. Experts do not always have the answer of taking us through the uncertainty. And we're going to see a little number of examples why that's the case. But we need something to hold on to and to move forward. And that's why I'm going to introduce a simple but quite useful and potentially powerful framework to conceptualize uncertainty and thereby be able to make decisions with a little more confidence. And I call this framework leveling uncertainty. This will lead us then to the role of the leader in uncertain environments at times like these, because the role of the leader here is very different from what we are supposed to do in normal operating environments. And we're going to conclude with a discussion of strategic agility and how strategic agility can be a quite useful antidote to uncertainty. And even if it doesn't make the uncertainty disappear, it helps the organization to react in time and thereby perhaps deal with that uncertainty better than what their competitors are doing. So that's a program for the day. So I'm going just to make a very quick stop to take some water. I had so many online delivering sessions last week that my voice is already going. So to prevent that, I'll say just cheers. How uncertain is our world? We are now at the end of May 2020. Can I just take you mentally back 5 months? 5 months ago, you were contemplating the end of the year 2019. You were probably gathering your thoughts, your desires, your commitments, your intentions to 2020. You were trying to figure out mentally what that year would bring. And I'm pretty confident you had no clue. It was impossible to you to imagine that what you see on that slide here, this is what the year would bring, not only for you, but for all of us. We had to learn a whole new language. COVID-19, lockdown, social distancing. We are in a new normality, something that would have been completely abnormal to us just a couple of months ago. But this is also a measure of uncertainty. Actually, I went back about a year and I looked at a global risk report. This report had been published by the World Economic Forum and it looked at risks that were appearing on the radar screen, and these risks were positioned on the matrix in terms of their likelihood. So how probable is it for them to happen over the next year? And you see that the likelihood is increasing if we go over to the right-hand side. And on the vertical dimension, we have the impact. So if the risk materializes, how strong is the impact going to be in the sense of how dire, how important are the consequences going to be? And the impact is also increasing the more we move up north. Now we have here a whole collection of very interesting risks, some of them being considered very likely and having a very high impact, like, for example, extreme weather events, the failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, natural disasters, but also cyber attacks, water crisis, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse. These were the risks that had been positioned in the top right corner of that matrix, meaning the ones we should have been most concerned of back in 2019, looking at 2020, because they are the most likely to happen, and at the same time, they were deemed to have the highest impact. Well, nobody of us talks about natural disasters these days, not even or hardly cyber attacks. Water crises are not interesting right now, because all we focus our attention on is just this one thing: spread of infectious diseases. This is what COVID-19 is all about. It had been recognized as a risk with a quite significant impact, but not the highest, meaning there were quite a few of them considered to have a higher impact, and it was not considered very likely. It is more towards the left side of this matrix. So if you were a senior decision maker looking towards the future for your organization at the end of 2019, and you decide, let's only consider the top 10, 12 risks that we have to deal with, very likely COVID-19 would not have been one of them. So the point of my digression here is, we now have to deal with something that actually nobody really expected that we would have to deal with it so soon. This is also a measure of uncertainty. Well, let's turn to the army to help us think this through. I guess you're familiar with the word or the acronym VUCA. VUCA stands for volatile, so volatility, uncertainty, complex, and ambiguous. So 4 characteristics of the environment that we find ourselves in today. VUCA as a concept was coined by the US military a long time ago. By a long time ago, I mean 33 years ago. In 1987, the US military was facing the breakdown of the Soviet system. By 1987, it was clear to see it is going to crumble, and the world after the fall of communism would be a very different world. So what is this going to mean? And that's where they started some war gaming, scenario planning, in order to identify key drivers of uncertainty. And one concept that they invented in this process to help them think it through was the so-called VUCA concept. So VUCA stands for volatile. Volatility means essentially the speed of change. Things change all the time. We change every day. The world is changing every day a little bit. That's normal. That's the normal course of things. But volatility means the speed of change is significant and perhaps even accelerating. So that goalposts seem to be moved almost on a daily basis, making it very difficult to keep track of developments. But there's also a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty in a sense, the future is unpredictable because speed of change does not mean the same as unpredictability. If I have a very clear idea where the world is going, it just happens much faster, then there's very little uncertainty. Uncertainty in this sense means it is very difficult, if not impossible, to have an idea what the world is going to look like. Then we have complexity. Complexity as the number of factors that we need to consider, the variety of these factors and their interrelationships. And we have finally ambiguity, which means even if we have all the factors, we have all the measures, we have all the information and data, we don't know how to read it, we don't know how to interpret it. And the real VUCA environment is when these four factors come together. And this pretty much defines, I think, the situation that we are all facing today. So where do we go from here? Well, we could turn to experts, but experts do not always have the answer. They tell us, yeah, we're living in a VUCA world. Fine. It sounds like such a compelling concept, VUCA, but in itself, does it really help? Does it tell you what to do, what the next step should be? I don't think so. In itself, VUCA is just a very useless concept taken on its own. So we need to fill it with meaning, and more importantly, we need to know where do we go from here. So as I said a little earlier, we can talk to experts, but they don't always have the answer. I'm not aware how the scientific or political debate in Poland is going these days, but in England, in the UK, it is a big mess. Politicians not listening to experts, or when they listen to experts, only to some experts who are marginalized among the wider group of experts. You're asking two experts about what is the way out of the COVID crisis, and you receive three answers, and these answers go into different directions. So experts are not really helpful in a VUCA environment because they know so much about their area that they just can't imagine anything beyond that. Let's just revisit a couple of funny examples from history, how experts can get it so wrong. This was in 1486, when a certain Christopher Columbus approached the King and the Queen of Spain to fund his venture to discover a new land. The advice that the royalty was given by their experts was that after so many centuries, it was very unlikely, if not impossible, that somebody would find any new unknown land of any value. A couple of centuries later, heavier than air flying machines are impossible. This was 8 years before the Wright brothers launched their first flight of their Kitty Hawk. And the person, Lord Kelvin, who made this prediction, who made this statement, heavier than air flying machines are impossible, well, he was one of the foremost experts of his time. A mathematician, a physicist, a president of the Royal Society. So if somebody should have been knowing something about the physics of flight, it should have been him. But apparently, he completely misread his own expertise. 1904, airplanes are interesting toys, but of no military value. Ferdinand Foch, a 7-star French marshal, military expert. 1936, the New York Times was writing, a rocket will never be able to leave the Earth's atmosphere. Well, this was just 7 years before it happened for the first time. And a much more recent example, 2007, good old Steve Ballmer, who was then CEO of Microsoft, and Microsoft was reacting, or were asked, how do you react to the iPhone? And he essentially said, well, I'm not worried at all. There's not a chance, but really not a single chance that the iPhone is going to take any significant market share. So experts don't have the answers, because just as generals, they always fight the previous war. So my worry or my concern is, as we're starting to draw up the lessons from COVID-19, what have we learned from this crisis? I'm more concerned about what are we not learning? Because mastering this crisis, because one day we will get through it, might only create some new false security and many more blind spots. What are we forgetting? What are we not worrying enough about now that we are all focusing on COVID-19? And that's why we need to get away a little bit from experts. So I have one suggestion how we can do that and how we can move towards the future. And this suggestion starts with a poem. It starts with a poem from a very highly unusual poet who was sitting in the Pentagon. Donald Rumsfeld, former US Secretary of Defense, 2001, 2006. I love this poem so much I have to read it word by word. As we know, there are no knowns. These are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, there are some things we know we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. It's fantastic, isn't it? Pure poetry. He actually was mocked and got an award in order for him to say that this is really very, very bad English. And it probably is. But for once in his life, he made perfect sense. Because this is what it is really about. When we consider uncertainty, we talk about the unknown. So uncertainty are all the things we don't know. But then there are things beyond that, what we even don't know that we don't know. But there are also things, as he said himself, that we consider as unknown, but we might actually be able to know them. So Rumsfeld's poem actually gives us an introduction to a very interesting concept to deal with levels of uncertainty. So we have the known and all those that we consider as unknown. Within the unknown, however, there are two areas. There is one that we don't know, but that would be actually knowable. Meaning, if we did a good enough effort, we could actually find out a lot of things in that area. And thereby reducing the importance of that which is the residual uncertainty, the uncertainty that remains after the best possible analysis. So one way of dealing with uncertainty, of leading through uncertainty, is to actually reframe it in a way that we can increase the knowable and thereby reduce what is left after best possible analysis. A couple of years ago, I was training McKinsey consultants at the London office. And in exchange for my work, they gave me something. They gave me their toolkit that they use with the clients to deal with uncertainty. So McKinsey actually considers different levels of uncertainty, because uncertainty is not equal to uncertainty. There's something they call a clear future. Then there are alternative futures, range of futures, and lastly, true ambiguity, which I would consider level 4. Level 1 is a clear future. It is essentially a linear forecast based on our observations today, based on recent experience, based on all the data that we have. We feel confident we can make a forecast about what are sales going to be over the next 12 months. And our forecast, we are quite confident it will be within 95% of, or 97% even, of what we're actually going to register. Like, for example, next year's customer numbers in the town center, McDonald's outlets, there's very little mystique or secrecy about that. It is still uncertain. There's no guarantee that it's going to happen. But the factors to be taken into consideration are so limited and the data is so rich that we can make a clear forecast. So this is level 1 uncertainty, clear future. If we move from level 1 to level 2, here, point forecast, linear extrapolation from the past is no longer possible. But what is possible is to distinguish different outcomes. For example, it has to be 1, 2, or 3. These are all the things that can happen. It has to be one of them. It cannot be anything else. 1996 was the year when the US telecommunications industry got deregulated. In the US, up to 1996, there were two completely separate markets. There was the local market, which was a monopoly, and then there was one company, AT&T, which had a monopoly for all the communications from one city to another, from one state to another, so for all nationwide calls in the US. So under pressure from Congress and other stakeholders, the debate began in the US, should we deregulate the industry? Now, if you were a major operator, you needed to prepare for an uncertain future. You would have no idea what is your operating environment going to look like in a couple of months or in a year or two. So it was impossible to forecast this is what is going to happen. But it was possible to identify 4 distinct outcomes of the deregulation debate in the US, and you knew it would have to be one of them. For example, Congress can't decide and can't agree with the president, so no deregulation. That is a clear, distinct outcome. Or Congress decides to deregulate only the long distance calls, leaving the local monopoly in place. Or Congress decides to deregulate only short distance calls, leaving the long distance monopoly in place. Or Congress decides to deregulate both short and long distance calls. So these are 4 distinct outcomes. It had to be one of them. Together, they define whatever is possible in terms of outcomes. So this is clearly a higher level of uncertainty compared to level 1. But the fact that we have 4 different outcomes, this lends itself to the use of, for example, scenario planning. We can think them through and we can try to understand what is important for winning in scenario A compared to, for example, scenario B. So by and large, this is a level of uncertainty where any executive should still feel comfortable working with. Level 3, that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. If we consider, for example, the future demand for second generation biodiesels, is it possible to develop scenarios? Well, we're getting into a degree of complexity here where it seems to be difficult of identifying a limited number of drivers. All that we seem to be able to say is we have a broad area where the outcome has to be, but there is very limited room of bringing it to anything that we feel comfortable working with. This is just like looking at the oil price and then, for example, bringing technical elements that it has to be over 20 and probably also for technical market reasons, it has to be under $200 per barrel. So this would define a range of from 20 to 200, which is a massive range, but we know it cannot really be beyond 200 and it can't really be below 20. So this would be a sort of analogy for a range of futures. We can see broad boundaries, but we cannot really say where's it going to be within these boundaries. And then we have true ambiguity. This would be level 4. And with true ambiguity, we essentially do not even know where to start. There are so many things happening. There's so many factors to consider. There's so many relationships among them that it seems almost impossible to have a view on the future. Many years ago, one of my colleagues was sent by his company to work in the early years of post-communist Russia and to try to run a business there. And he gave me a long list of things that he had to worry about every day. He was completely operating in level 4 uncertainty, where we have true ambiguity. This is where we really want to have a crystal ball. This is where we don't think we even can define these boundaries that we have at level 3. I've prepared a quick exercise for you in order to to test your understanding of these levels of uncertainty and what we can do with them. Now, in a moment, I'm going to start a poll, so a survey, and you're going to be asked to give your assessment. What is the level of uncertainty associated with these 4 questions or statements? Brexit after 31st December 2020. So how does Brexit look after the end of this year? What is the future of air travel going to be like? Or what is the future of the airline business going to be like? What's the return on investment of a new Starbucks outlet in Warsaw? And what's the future of cryptocurrencies in financial transactions? So I'm not looking for the answer here. So for example, for the 3rd point, return on investment of a new Starbucks out in Warsaw, I'm not looking to you to tell me, oh, this is going to be 7.8%. No. What I want to know, is this a level 1 uncertainty, a level 2, a level 3, or a level 4? Same for Brexit after 31st December, the future of the airline industry, or the future role of cryptocurrencies. What is the level of uncertainty that you associate with them? So you have 4 questions to deal with, and I'm looking forward to your answers. Yeah, it's filling up nicely. Hopefully in a minute or so, we have all the answers. All right, we have 20 answers. I'm not sure we're going to get any more. That's why I am going to stop the poll at this moment and we're going to look at the results. So which level of uncertainty? What is Brexit going to look like after 31st of December 2020? Majority is level 3. Some people suggest level 2. Very few suggest either level 1 or level 4. Which level of uncertainty does the future hold for airlines? Again, it's level 3, but for 20% also they suggest it might be level 4. Which level of uncertainty for the return on investment of a new Starbucks outlet in Warsaw? It's level 2, yes, and I personally feel we could have been a little braver here, and then because Starbucks is very good at measuring footfall and data mining. I know when they open a new outlet, they know exactly what they're making. So personally, I would have put this at level 1. And then which level of uncertainty, future role of cryptocurrencies in financial transactions? Yeah, this seems to be very complex as a topic. So a lot of ambiguity, complexity, different factors involved, a lot of technical knowledge needed. This is probably what has been responsible for the quite strong numbers for level 3 and level 4. What I find interesting here is it's a nice spread. Some people for some answers went for level 1, whereas for others it was level 4. So how is that possible? Well, that is possible because my questions were deliberately framed in a very hard way. So how do we use the levels of uncertainty in order to, or bring us more towards an area where we feel we know enough? One way would be to introduce time frames. So for example, instead of asking about the future of cryptocurrencies and financial transactions in general, if I had asked you, how is it going to look like by the end of the year? It's just 7 months from now. You probably would have felt a little more confident and thereby reduced the level of uncertainty. So reframing the question, introducing time frames, that is an essential step in order to reduce uncertainty, or breaking the problem down into a range of constituent elements, reasoning backwards instead of thinking forward. Let me show you an example how this could look like. If we are working in, just go on one slide. If we are working in biotech and we have to decide whether we're going to commit $50 million on investment in a new therapy field, then we're looking towards the future and we may come to the conclusion that this is level 4, true ambiguity. It's a new therapy field. We're not 100% sure that it is going to work. There's so many questions to consider. What about the regulatory environment? What about competition? What about the market? What about other stakeholders? What about technology? So level 4 ambiguity, and then we can just stare at the check. Do we really want to underwrite 50 million investment when we are looking at level 4 uncertainty? Probably not. And then the safest bet might be not do anything and let others go for it and potentially go bankrupt. Well, it's true. There are so many factors to be taken into account here that no amount of analysis would allow us to identify a return on investment range with any degree of confidence. That's why what we're going to do is not to work forwards, looking to the future and think through how do we get there. We are actually going to the future and we are thinking backwards. How did we come to that point? And this change in perspective actually changes a lot. And this helps us to roll back uncertainty. So for example, if our target for return on investment is at least 15%, Then what we can do is we can develop different scenarios in terms of demand, disease development, reimbursement rules and regulations, price, competition, etc. We can develop different scenarios in which we would be able to earn at least 15% in terms of return on investment. That's not complicated. We can figure that out. Then the next step is, for each of these scenarios, we need to identify what would we have to believe to happen or to be true in order for this scenario to materialize. For example, we look at our scenarios that we have defined where we can earn at least 15% of return on investment. And now we're breaking it down in its constituent elements. Like, for example, for one of these scenarios to come true, we would have to have an effectiveness of our treatment of at least 65%. Time to market has to be 30 months, if not less. The prescription rate by physicians would have to be 70% or higher. The reimbursement rate of our treatment by insurances has to be at least 80%. The number of years of patent protection, once we bring it to the market, has to be at least still 8 years left. And we would have to assume that there's no availability of similar treatments or substitute treatments for the first 6 years when our treatment is on the market. These would be the implied elements or assumptions of one of the scenarios that would allow us to earn at least a 15% return on investment. Now, these assumptions that we would have to make, we can check them against what do we know of our industry, of the pharmaceutical industry, what are industry benchmarks, what does past history say? So how plausible are these assumptions? How plausible are these elements based on what we know? Then, for example, we can find that the average effectiveness of most recent therapies in related adjacent disease areas has been 67%, which is slightly higher than what we need. We see that the prescription rate by physicians for these therapies is currently 73%, which is still in line and better than what we need. That insurances reimburse on average 84% of the cost, which is again above what we need to assume, but substitutes appeared on average 3.3 years after launch, whereas we would have to assume at least 6 years without appearance of any substitutes. So that way we can decompose the scenario and we can check and perhaps at this stage already decide, well, if the availability of substitutes is really a strong value driver, then probably this scenario is not that likely to happen. So what I'm trying to say here is we are no longer at level 4 uncertainty. What we've been doing here is thinking backwards, breaking it down, reducing uncertainty by working backwards. What do we need to believe to be true? What do we need to assume to happen? What are all these different elements that we need to have to believe in order for this scenario or the other scenario to come true? So that's the way what McKinsey recommends to its clients of dealing with uncertainty, working backwards, trying to reduce it step by step, reducing a level 4 uncertainty to a level 3, and perhaps a level 3 to a level 2 by identifying the 2 key drivers that seem to define the boundaries of what is possible. Because if we've broken it down to 2 key drivers, then we have a brilliant tool, the scenario planning technique that we can use. So that's McKinsey's recommendation of dealing with uncertainty. So using these uncertainty levels, it actually creates a language for uncertainty for your strategic conversations in your organizations. And it also makes it clear that whereas often we fall into 2 extreme positions, either pretending I know what the future is going to be like, so treating everything as level 1 uncertainty, or being paralyzed by uncertainty by assuming everything is level 4, whereas it is probably in these intermediate levels of level 2 or level 3 uncertainty where most of the decisions that we have to take as managers are going to take place. This is at least what McKinsey believes. For them, 70 to 80% of all the decisions for the future that you have to take as a manager are level 2 or level 3 uncertainty. They are not at the extreme points 1 or 4. Now, in conjunction with these elements of uncertainty, I'd like to recommend something else to, well, lead or learn how to lead through uncertainty. And this goes back to the works of two famous strategists and leadership practitioners. One is Stacey, and the other one is Heifetz. Let's start with Stacey. Stacey is somebody that probably you will never have heard of, because he doesn't write for practitioners. He doesn't work with practitioners. But the people who do write for practitioners and work with them, they often turn to Ralph Stacey, a British academic from the University of Hertfordshire, because his thinking is in the area of complexity theory. He thinks through organizations as complex elements struggling to survive in their environment, and his insights are actually quite thought-provoking. This is one of his famous matrices that can also help us guide through uncertainty by focusing the attention more on your own role as leaders. So the matrix has two dimensions, which is certainty. Are we closer to certainty, or are we moving away from certainty and therefore towards the uncertain? And the other dimension is, how much agreement do we have in the organization what the right way forward is? Are we closer to it, or are we moving away from agreement and thereby towards different agendas and conflicts? Now, for Stacey, this is the area of management, the bottom left corner. We have quite good certainty about what the problem is and what might happen. And by and large, we have a good degree of agreement. And that's where managers earn their money, by protecting the status quo, by repairing the engine when it has been breaking down. So all the traditional management tools, this is where we need them: resource allocation, planning, monitoring, and controlling. Unfortunately, none of these elements is going to be of any help if we are here, if we are in the realm of the uncertain, and if we are far away from having agreement in the organization about what needs to be done. Just consider the current COVID-19 debate, probably in Poland not different from Germany or the UK, which is half of the government wants to open up the country as soon as possible in order to ensure education and protect the economy, while the other half thinks this is too dangerous and privileges rather the safety and the health of the population. So it is an uncertain environment. We still don't understand the virus fully, and there's vast disagreement about what the important things need to be. So that's the area where management doesn't help. What we need here is leadership. And this is what the role of the leader entails, in these environments, meaning promoting debate, diversity, fostering connectivity. So this is much more the role of an orchestrator, stating intentions, what you want to do, what you think is the right thing to do, and leading the inquiry, leading the debate into that area. And this is actually very, very close to the works of another quite inspirational academic. This is Heifetz. He's a senior lecturer in public leadership at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And he opposes technical challenges and adaptive challenges. Technical challenges are challenges where the solution is known. We can turn to experts. They can tell us exactly what needs to be done. It's like, for example, if we want to protect the hygiene in a hospital, there are medical hygiene experts for that. Now with COVID, we don't have a technical challenge. We have an adaptive challenge. We don't know what the solution is. We don't understand enough about the virus and the repercussions into our daily life, into the economy, into the way we shop, into the way how we live are just too strong. There are no experts helping us with that. Here, the role of the leader is to find solutions, to help others together to find solutions. So here we find the same distinction again, management, experts, this is technical challenge. But in times like these, the role of the executive, of the leader, it's different. It's not to provide answers. It is to orchestrate debate and processes where we can find solutions. That's how Heifetz opposes it. Technical challenges, managers are expected to define the problem and provide a solution. For adaptive challenges, the ones that we're facing in high uncertainty situations, like the ones we are in right now, this is not going to work because as a leader, they don't have the answers. Nobody has the answer for COVID-19 today. And as a leader, this is something then, in this situation, as in other high uncertain situations, this is something that you need to accept and to admit to yourself and to others. I don't have the answer. And this is easier said than done, because in many organizations, especially those who come more from quite established mindsets, quite traditional conservative mindsets, if you are a leader, you are paid for giving the answer. But in a VUCA environment, you can't give the answer because you can't have it. So your role has to be a very different role. It is a role of involving people, defining the problem, launching the process of defining the problem, guiding the search for solutions through experimentation. It is about helping to frame issues in a way that we can find the next step forward, identifying, unearthing the right questions to ask. Remember what we did a couple of minutes earlier when we were looking at the different levels of uncertainty. I can frame any question in a way that you will come to the conclusion, this is level 4 uncertainty. But with a little bit of effort, I think we can also frame many questions in a way that the level 4 uncertainty will be reduced to level 3 or level 2, if not even to level 1. So that's the role of the leader in uncertain environments, not giving answers, but raising questions and orchestrating the process, the collective process where solutions are going to be worked out. This emphasis on the role of finding a solution together, I think it was never better illustrated than during the Cuban Missile Crisis 1962. Remember from history lessons, when the world was really at the brink of nuclear war. This is the executive committee meeting that for 13 days was trying to find a solution. How do we avoid nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union when you didn't know the intentions, beliefs, operating routines on the other side? This was an absolute VUCA environment. But the way they finally worked through a solution was not by Kennedy, right here in the middle, giving answers. He was the orchestrator of the process, making sure that the military is involved, but does not take too much center stage, that advisors are involved, that Congress is involved, that many people come together in that room and together define that solution. Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy, he was one of the members of the executive committee, and he later came to this conclusion that this was actually a very, very powerful exercise, because he was afraid that out of the 14 people, if 6 of them had been US president instead of his brother, then probably the world might have been blown up just by the intuitive reaction of experts. I know what to do. We don't need to debate. I know it already. But this is, in a VUCA environment, this is recipe for disaster. The solution came here, like in most other VUCA scenarios, it came only from a collective process of sense making, developing options and considering these options together, day by day integrating new information in order to slowly but progressively walk towards the future. And a final example to which this is also strongly related is strategic agility. So that's another useful concept I find of dealing with uncertainty. So again, we have a nice matrix with nature of change being more complex and systemic in a VUCA world, speed of change being fast, and as Yves Doos from INSEAD and Mikko Kosonen, a former strategy director of Nokia, concluded, this is a VUCA environment where only strategic agility can really help us. So what is strategic agility? For Yves Doos and Kosonen, it has 3 dimensions. It's the strategic sensitivity. How clear are we about what is going on? The sharpness of perception. But it also implies resource fluidity, meaning how mobile are resources inside the company? How easy is it to reallocate budgets, to move out of a market area and to increase commitment and exploration in another, to kill off projects and to start new ones. So to continuously experiment without having a clear mind or determined mind on what the final direction needs to be, but being able to move as soon as possible, as soon as you have that clarity. That's what we mean by resource fluidity. And it also requires leadership unity, meaning the top team actually working together and assuming their role. Well, that's theory. In reality, what Doos and Kosonen find is that we have tunnel vision, strategic short-sightedness, mental frameworks where we see ourselves as dominant in the market, or we are the good ones, the others are the bad ones. So strategic sensitivity declines in many organizations on a daily basis. Resource fluidity also declines because of imprisoned resources, where we have divisional leaders, business unit leaders who say, well, this is my budget. It was given to me. I'm not going to share it with anybody. Or these are my people. Don't you even dare invite them to work on your project. They are mine. So resources are owned by strong organizational leaders. So this reduces the fluidity, the mobility of resources. And instead of leadership unity, we can have conflict at the top leadership team. We can have expert management where leaders say, no, we're not going to take any decision. We are calling McKinsey in. They're going to tell us what to do. So leadership unity also declines, but then agility goes and the organization cannot react anymore. An example where this happened was Nokia. When Nokia was confronted with the competition of the iPhone in 2006, 2007, the way how Nokia worked was anything but agile. So senior leaders were afraid of the external environment, of not meeting analyst targets. They're punished middle managers for telling them things they didn't want to hear. So middle managers withheld information from top leaders or even lied to them for fear of telling the truth. There was a widespread belief that the new Symbian platform, their operating system, would prove superior to iOS. The culture was status driven, where managers were anxious to hold on to their resources. And there were competence gap in the top management team, so very few engineers. So this means if we look at this strategic agility framework, actually many of the things that reduce agility were there. So strategic myopia, dominance mindset, Symbian is going to be the best. Imprisoned resources, management mediocrity, emotional apathy, fear running through the organization, management divergence, top management punishing middle management. So we can understand then why Nokia essentially reacted like a deer in the headlight. When the iPhone came on the market, Nokia froze. The organization could not deal with that uncertainty because it wasn't agile enough. Now, I'm realizing that I have been talking for far too long, and I assume that there are any questions that you would like to ask. Yes, is it possible to get the presentation per email? Yes, I think that is possible. And the GFKM team, they were going to take charge of that just after this webinar. Now, before we come to questions, just to sum up my key points. So my wish for you is don't be this deer in the headlight. Uncertainty is that it's not going to go away. It might even be much more than we think in the future going forward. But there is something that we can all do in order to avoid it or deal with it. We can't avoid it completely. So yes, we should listen to experts, but we should not expect them to have the answer, because they can't, they don't agree on each other. This doesn't mean that we can discard completely what they're saying, but we need to be aware. Ultimately, decisions are judgment calls, and they're not made by experts, they're made by leaders. Imagine different futures and reason backwards. So that's the idea with the different levels of uncertainty, and the example with the biotech investment that we quickly discussed. So imagining the future and making sure I understand what would I have to believe in terms of things that have to be true, in terms of things that need to happen in order to produce that scenario. So working backwards intuitively is often easier than looking at the future from the position in the present where we are. This is often when we get the feeling, oh my God, this is level 4. I don't even know where to start. So working backwards might be better than thinking forwards. Framing the issue, raising questions, orchestrating the debate. So that's the different role of a leader in a VUCA environment. Remember, this is not about providing answers. You can't have the answers, but this is about helping the organization to identify the questions and orchestrate the debate by involving the right people. So this is about a collective sense making, a collective process of walking towards the future, and make sure you build agility in the organization. And that's where the strategic agility concept by Kossonen and Yves Dawes can be a good guideline. What are the areas you need to look to in order to be able to react to the implications of uncertainty as they unfold on a continuous basis? So these were the couple of things I wanted to share with you. I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. So we have one: will events of recent month have a significant impact on leadership and management styles? I think that they will, and they have to, because I don't think that we're going to go back to what was our normality, our normal life before. Something has to change. people are not going to accept anymore that leaders have the answers, because it is obvious for everybody to see that experts are struggling, our political leaders are struggling. Why should it be any different in organizations? So actually, in that sense, we can look at COVID-19 quite positively. It could be a catalyst, an enabler of more participative, more reflective, more involving, thereby also more engaging processes in organizations, which in the end would make our organizations a better place. So thanks for all your great comments. So as I said, the webinar has been recorded, and all the slides will be available for you. Just see whether we have any more